All right, some reading myths. Do we recognize words as a whole? Is that what that says? It's kind of interesting how easy it is to recognize words even when they're misspelled. I was talking about this yesterday. Well, I recorded it yesterday, but I was talking in the last video, the last chapter, about how well we do when reading misspelled texts. It's kind of shocking how well we do with that. We have a lot of tolerance for letters within the word, inside the word, being inverted or scrambled, because we do, to a large extent, sort of recognize what the word's going to be based on really the beginning and the ends of the words. So let me show you some data from a study. So here we have the control sentence. The boy could not solve the problem, so he asked for help. So all the words are spelled correctly. And what they found in the study was that people made, on average, they spent 236 milliseconds on fixations, and they were able to read, in the entire control thing, they spent 236 seconds on fixations, and they were able to read 255 words per minute on average. Now, when they did an internal transposition, which is where the first and last letters of the word are in the right position, but something in the middle is out of order, you see that the fixations get a little bit longer and the words per minute go down a little bit. So it does, with those internal transpositions, you do see a little bit of deficit in reading fluency. Like you may have to be doing some regressive saccades to go back and figure out what that was. Now, if the beginning letter is transposed, so now you're not starting with the correct letter, now our fixations go up a little bit more, but our words per minute really go down, right? Like you really had to, like maybe I have, fewer words that I'm stopping and fixating on, but boy, I really am spending some time on, what is supposed to be the word solve and really what's supposed to be problem. If you do an ending transposition, now you see that the fixations go up even more and the words per minute go down even more. So ending it with the wrong words, and I think I might have done a typo on the word problem there because I left out the O altogether. Sorry, I typed this to make this chart. So solve the problem, with the ending letters being inverted, looks like it's even worse than when the beginning letters are in the wrong position. The words in the middle, the letters in the middle being mixed up, now in context of other things, you realize not as bad. The fixations are roughly the same for the internally transposed and the beginning transposed. But you really drop in words per minute if you have the beginning transposed, and then you get further drop if the end is. So do we recognize words as a whole? Kinda. Definitely, if the front and the end is basically where it begins, where it belongs. So in the internal transposition one, we see, you probably could do a pretty good job of reading that without even necessarily having to do too much work. Now, drawing inferences. We've used the word inference a lot in this class, but so just as a reminder, these are conclusions that are being drawn, and in this case by the reader, right? So, we draw inferences about things that aren't explicitly stated in the discourse. So, Greg left the game disgusted by his team's inability to score. So in this context, nothing was really said about the final conclusion of the game, but the inference we would draw is that his team lost, right? He left the game disgusted by his team's inability to score. It makes it sound like they must have lost. But honestly, there's a couple of inferences that we're drawing with this sentence. We're assuming he left after the game was over, but maybe he left in the middle of the game. And he doesn't know that actually they turned it around in the second part and ended up winning. Like, we don't really know. It wasn't explicitly stated in the discourse, but our pre-existing knowledge base causes us to impose some meaning on it. We use a combination of our existing knowledge and then what is in the text to help us to draw these inferences. These inferences then become part of our mental representation of the text. And so we actually remember the story being about the team losing, even though it didn't explicitly say that. Our inference becomes part of the memory. And we've talked about this before when we were talking strictly about memory, that it doesn't matter if it really happened in the event or not. If you drew the inference at the time that the memory was being made, or even if you draw the inference the next time you think about the memory, it'll get stored away with that memory and it becomes part of the memory. And the same is true in our mental representation of, a text, or I could extend this out to TV shows or movies, right? Anytime that something's being presented to us. So what types of inferences do we tend to make? Well, there's the bridging inference, where we connect two ideas that were not explicitly connected in the writing. So we sometimes call this a backward inference, and you'll see why here with this example. It allows the reader to bridge the current information back to earlier information. So for example, the movie was incredibly tense and exciting. Bridget was on the edge of her seat. Okay, so what kind of inference are you drawing as you're hearing that the movie was incredibly tense and exciting? Bridget was on the edge of her seat. You're probably inferring A, she was at a movie. B, that she was on the edge of her seat because she was engaged in the action or the scary thing, or you're drawing some inference about what made the movie tense and exciting, right? Like all of these things help you to figure out, like the fact that Bridget was on the edge of her seat is related back to the fact that the movie was incredibly tense and exciting, and you're filling in a bunch of blanks about that. So your experience with tense and exciting movies, or your experience with ever being on the edge of your seat. I was actually watching the fairy tale about Little Red Riding Hood with my 3-year-old granddaughter today, and she was sitting on my lap while she was watching it, and she literally at one point during the fairy tale, she slapped my leg and then leaned forward like she was literally on the edge of her seat. I thought, well, that was pretty darn adorable. But from the time you're really little, you probably have a concept of like something being really engaging or exciting or whatever, and that causes you to lean forward and whatever. So you have a really wide knowledge base about what it means to be on the edge of your seat, right? Okay, how about causal inferences as a type of inference? Causal inferences would be when you infer the cause of an event. So it's another type of bridging inference. This is not a separate thing from what I was just talking about. It's a type of bridging inference. If we have an example here, Serena held the ticket and watched the cop drive away. I'll never text and drive again, she thought. So what inference can we draw from that? She just got ticketed for texting and driving. Maybe she was in an accident while texting and driving. That she must have been texting and driving, right? So, like these are things that you're sort of just, these inferences happen so automatically that when I ask you what inference did you make, you may actually spend a second going, I don't think I made any, because you think it's so obvious. It was included in the passage when in fact the words she was texting were never in that passage. She just said she'll never text and drive again. After the cop drove away and she's holding a ticket, we think, well, why else would she be holding a ticket except for that she must have been texting and driving, right? Like this inference seems logical, but it may not be. It may not be. How about an elaborative inference? Adding extra information to the representation of the text. This is called a forward inference because you're going to be moving forward. That is beyond what is in the text. So Jason felt satisfied as he finished wrapping the tiny box. She's going to love it, he assured himself. So what inference are you making? Some people in my classes have said that it's an engagement ring, but I'm like, who wraps an engagement ring? So I'm not sure I would make that inference. Who wraps an engagement ring? I don't think so. But I think we're all thinking jewelry, because what else would you give to a woman in a tiny box that she would love, right? Well, honestly, there are a lot of things you could give to a woman in a tiny box that she would love. But our inference, we're moving beyond what's in the textbook, in the text that was provided, and tiny box getting wrapped, she's going to love it. We go ahead and draw conclusions. We elaborate on what it must be inside that tiny box because of our experience, our knowledge base. So when do we make inferences? Well, the constructionist view says that inferring is an active process, that we do in fact form inferences intentionally, and this is very much a top-down view, that we say to ourselves, I'm trying to understand this material that I'm reading, and so I have got to draw some conclusions as I'm going along, right? I need to draw some inferences so it'll make sense. The minimalist view says inferring things is really automatic. It's memory driven, and it's much more bottom up, that, as information comes in, it triggers the imposition of automatic memory driven inferences to be made. I tend to lean towards the minimalist view, because my personal experience with inferences is that I do them so automatically that sometimes, like I said earlier, I don't even realize I've done it. I feel like I didn't even do it. It was, wait a minute, that wasn't in the material. What are you talking about? You go back and read it and you're like, oh, wow. It doesn't actually tell us that the team lost, right? It doesn't tell you reread it with somebody calling you on your inference that you're like, holy cow, I did infer that. So I tend to take that minimalist view that, it's automatic and that it's being triggered by the input of information that's coming in a bottom-up way. But these are, two competing views on how it's done. All right, so how we comprehend discourse. So discourse is more than just reading words. It's understanding like the prose passage that you're reading, or the dialogue in the book that you're reading, or whatever. One way that we comprehend discourse is through schemas. Schemas, as you recall, are general knowledge that we hold. They're like frameworks for understanding new information. Well, we have general information. We have general knowledge stored about some specific person or a place or a specific kind of person or event. Like we have pre-existing knowledge about just about everything that can help bolster our comprehension of the material that we're reading right now. Schemas help to guide the coding of information and the retrieval processes that we have to go through when we're trying to comprehend the stuff that we're reading. Reading comprehension really depends on us tying what we're consuming together with what we already know. And so schemas really help to facilitate that. Scripts are knowledge bases representing routine activities. So these would be mental frameworks for how a routine activity typically would go. A good example I like to give is, when you go to a restaurant. If you walk into the restaurant and it has a menu above the counter, in big letters, you realize that this is the kind of place that you have to go to the counter and order. Whereas if they don't have that, and even if there's nobody there to greet you, you see maybe a stack of menus, you realize this is a place where you're going to sit down and they're going to take your order, right? Like that's a script for what's likely to happen. These kinds of scripts are really important for maintaining a coherent representation of the discourse that you're consuming. A lot of times you need a script for how a plot tends to run. There's a reason why plots kind of follow peaks and valleys and very traditional trajectories, because that facilitates the reader's understanding. So they're written in a way that conforms to typical scripts, and that helps to solidify the scripts in your mind. Because every time you've ever read about this or whatever, it has been consistent with your existing scripts. When there's a script violation, it's very memorable. You go to a restaurant, they have the menu above the counter, but they tell you, no, you have to sit at your table and order from this thing that's above the counter, but from your table. Like that would be a really memorable event that I'm supposed to be able to read this from across the room. Right, this is completely violating my script for how restaurants run, right? So those script violations can be really memorable, but they're surprising and they don't fit your expectations, and so they can be difficult for you to follow the plot. I'm having trouble thinking of good books as examples of this, but I'm thinking of movies that oftentimes use the strategy of like hopping back and forth in time. Oh, I just thought of a good book that does it. I can't remember the full title. It's something about Where the Crawdads Sing, I think is the title of it. It's a very popular book right now. And it hops back and forth in time. And that kind of script violation is kind of tricky because you can't remember sometimes once you get a few pages into it, which decade was I in? Yeah, like where is this taking place? Who are the characters in this? Is this person a child or is this person an adult right now? Those kinds of violations can actually make it really labor intensive and kind of a little more cognitive effort involved in understanding what you're reading. Now, story grammars are really specifically, they are schemas that are specifically related exclusively to things that you're reading, stories. Story grammars are that idea that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end to a story. That there are protagonists and antagonists. That there is a particular like sort of formula to the plot development. That you typically expect a resolution at the end of the story that you're reading. These are things that are unique to these kinds of stories, right? It could be plays and movies also, honestly, but we're talking about reading. But this idea that when there's a story involved, you have certain expectations about how it should go. And again, when there are violations of those expectations, it's really surprising and can really interfere with processing. All right. I think this is a really good time to take a break. We will come back and we'll talk about structure building in the next segment.